Hello, listeners. Welcome to another episode of the Jacob Shapiro Podcast. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro, partner and director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. I have been looking for a Venezuela expert to come on the podcast to talk to us about what's happening in Venezuela. We hinted at it last week with the weekly podcast with Rob, and I'm glad we did because obviously it's the big news story of the week, maybe of the quarter, who knows. Elo is not a Venezuela expert. He'll be the first to tell you that, neither am I, but Elo is an expert on the region in general, on political communications, and he was willing to come on and at least have a general framing conversation with me, and it really was a conversation. That's what I want all these podcast episodes to be, but I hope you take as much away from the conversation as I did and as I think Elo did, and we will have more updates as we go. As you can probably imagine, Venezuela experts are in high demand right now, so it's difficult to get them on a podcast that is as small as mine. I mean, it's not that small, but we're not going to compete with the other folks that are going after their time. So we'll get to them eventually, and this is something that we're watching very closely. You can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to talk about any of this. There are limited investment implications for Venezuela directly, although there are some implications there in general. But if you're thinking about commodities, if you're just thinking about what this means for the world in general, there are a lot of implications there too. So happy to talk to you about any and all of those things. Otherwise, take care of the people you love. I'll drop the objective garb for just one moment and say good luck to the Venezuelan people. I'm not optimistic that this is going to go well, but I hope that I'm wrong about that. Cheers and see you out there. All right, Elo, most of the listeners can't see you, although if they check us out on YouTube, they'll be able to see that you're sitting at what looks like a cafe in front of, is that Lake Mendota behind you in Madison, Wisconsin?
This is Lake Mendota, and this is one of the most beautiful places in Madison, which is the Memorial Union Terrace, which technically is part of the university.
Well, it looks beautiful, and as I was joking with you before, if I was sitting outside of New Orleans right now, I'd literally be drenched in sweat. You'd be able to see the stains all over my shirt. It wouldn't look particularly good, so I'm in my co-working space. I normally don't record from the co-working space, but big stuff is happening in Venezuela, so we're interrupting your lunch in front of the lake, and I'm here at the co-working space, and here we go. We're recording on Tuesday, July 30th. We're going to try to get this out 24 hours, 48 hours max, so some things may change between now and then. But neither you nor I are Venezuela experts. I'm trying to get some Venezuela experts on the podcast who can talk to us more granularly about what's going on. Hopefully we'll get that before the end of the week. But you are somebody who has a great point of view on the region. And you've had some ideas, and I've really wanted to talk to you about this as well, just because it's actually hard to get someone to talk to about these things. And maybe, I know there's a couple different ideas we want to dive down into, but the first, and this leverages your communications background, it's been remarkable to me to try and understand what's actually going on, because the legacy media, they've got nothing. Like Reuters, all the English language press that you normally focus on, they're a day late, they're a dollar short, they're just paraphrasing all the stuff that's happening on social media. If you want to put your finger really on the pulse of what's going on, there are videos on social media of what's happening in the streets. There are independent analysts who are geolocating all the different protests in the country. Then you have to sift through what is real, what is fake. Is this actually a video of the streets of Caracas? Is this something else from 5 years ago that's being used by a political actor that has something to say about this? And then you also have the countries around Venezuela. Honestly, they look like they're afraid to weigh in at all. I know that Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico are reportedly discussing putting out a joint statement about the situation. Okay, whoop-de-doo, you're going to do it. So now we know that you're discussing a statement that says absolutely nothing about what's going on. Your home country of Peru, which is not exactly a shining beacon for democracy, I noticed that Venezuela expelled your ambassador because apparently they didn't like what Peru was saying about the election results there. So maybe just start there. I mean, it's...
And we, as a response, immediately expelled their diplomats in the world.
Yeah, well, maybe that's Chavismo in sort of a nutshell, like, hold me back sort of fighting. I don't know. But
so, yeah, that is not the relevant part of the discussion, I'm pretty sure.
But I'll let you take it off from there, because, I mean, we're going to go down a lot of different rabbit holes, I think, in this conversation. But in some ways, the one that we have to keep coming back to is Maduro going to be here next week? Is he going to be in charge of Venezuela next week, in a month?
So I think nobody has the answer for that. But what I can tell you is so to start a conversation, we have to define the core of the discussion right now, after almost 2 days of the election. And the core of the discussion is the accountability of the results provided by the government, not by the government, by the electoral body, which is the official results, the accountability of the official results. That is the core of the discussion. If you start to peel the onion, everybody will be discussing about it. Okay? Because of what? Because you have the 51.2% that the electoral body gave to Maduro, and if I'm not wrong, 44 or 45.2% that the electoral body gives to Gonzalez, if I'm not wrong. So, and if you see the decimals, actually, it ends there. Then you have 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. So, statistically, it doesn't make sense, right? So, according actually to the Venezuelan law of what I heard, so the electoral body needs to provide the evidence transparently of how this was measured. And you have a combination of several ways to doing so, because you have this is electronic vote, but at the same time, each of the machines provide a final register of the votes in each of the places where you have each of the voting places. So you have that, and this is the kind of acts that the opposition say they have, and they are starting to digitalize, to put it on a website. So you have all the stakeholders, the political stakeholders, that are trying to prove their part, which is, so government saying, hey, we have won. Actually, I would correct myself. They are not trying to prove anything so far. And then the others are saying, hey, they have to prove it, and we have our evidence too. So everything comes to accountability. And then you will have the discussion that some of them will say, if they are in favor of the government, hey, we don't need to do it, or I don't care. Then you have the others that say, foreign actors, is like even the Carter Center is like, we want to see those acts to really make it accountable. And you have those like Peru or Argentina who say, hey, this election was wrong. So the core of this conversation right now, if it is the government will be able to prove their numbers, and if they are not, how they will be able to endure without doing it.
Yeah, I mean, don't you think that, I mean, first of all, I'm sure they can make up the numbers. If it's just about they have to print out some tally sheets that show that their results are real, which they're probably not real, like I'm sure they can find a way to print it off on the right paper or do whatever they need to do to thread the needle there. It seems to me the other, because, you know, you talked about Maduro and the current government. We've got the opposition who's claiming one thing too. But then there's two other actors that are sitting out here. The first is the street. People are out in the street and people are mad. And I can't believe that they're out in the street because they're like, oh, well, that 51 point whatever percent doesn't line up with the official tallies. That's why we're going to go out there and risk our lives by squaring off against these people because we want to say that. So there must be some kind of mob mentality that's happening there. And then there's also the Venezuelan armed forces, which were a little wishy-washy going into the election. The defense minister explicitly saying, I mean, he backed Maduro in the end, but explicitly saying at one point, if you lose the election, you should go home. You shouldn't be ruling. I mean, sort of opening the door.
But they have changed that. They have just changed that today.
Yeah, they did? Okay.
They said that this is a coup from the fascist forces led by the U.S.
Well, I mean, then mean, isn't it sort of game over then? It's just about how much violence and repression is it going to take to put the Venezuelan street back to where it needs to be? Because we're talking about a country where a quarter of the population has already left, and people who have means have already left. So we're really just talking about really poor, really impoverished people who are sick of the situation and sick of the hyperinflation and sick of the cronyism and the criminal thugs and all these other things. Do they really stand a chance just because we're waiting for the official tally sheets for Brazil and Colombia and the U.S. ambassador and everybody else to say, aha, like we have the tally sheets, like it's fine?
So I would say that this is different than any other process before, because if the government endures, they are becoming like in Ortega mode, full dictatorship without any kind of support in the streets. So what I want to say is that in the previous election, so you had with Chavez, he always won because he had the support. Then you had Maduro winning in the beginning of the 2010s, I think it was 2012, and he won. He still had support. Then in 2016 or 18, you have that there was no competitor, so he won. And now you have that he is trying to force his this election. So this is different, I think, first. Secondly, you have the image of Maduro that has decreased. He is weaker in terms of public expectations. His idea of I am the representative of the spirit of Chavez is not working anymore. Literally, this is a spiritual approach that he has with Chavez and with this celestial commitments. Then, and you have the people that are tired because the diaspora has increased, and they also have a pressure on the country, because you are talking about 6 to 8 million people. So the country is tired of this government. So if this government really endures, it has to be by force and only by force, right? Which is different than previously. When you can say whatever you can say about the process itself of the elections previously, but you had somehow people's support. Now you don't have it anymore. So because of that, I do think that in addition to the streets that you correctly described, you have how in parallel you have this pressure from foreign governments and from foreign entities to disclosure the evidence of the results. And I think in this dynamic between the government, the external pressure, and the street, you will have like the final outcome. That being said, I think that the endurance of the streets will be the key determinant, not the foreign pressure. The foreign pressure is only to demand from the government somehow of accountability, which eventually is the proof if they are getting power only based on force or not.
Yeah, that makes me a little pessimistic, because if the streets were going to rise in that way, it should be happening now. It's not normal that you have this kind of result and then there's a lull for a week or for days and then they come out sort of in force. Like, we should be seeing nonstop, momentum feeding on momentum, clashing with the National Guard or with the armed forces or anything like that. We have some like indications of that, but like not really. I don't see that critical mass that's there. And I also want to say, and this is where the geopolitics comes in, yes, Venezuela is facing some pressure from the outside, and it's mostly pressure from other Latin American states. So countries like Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, these are the ones that are calling the elections fraud. Brazil, Colombia, as I sort of mentioned, they're, like you said, waiting for transparency. They want to see the tallies. They're putting pressure on accountability from the Venezuelan government. But there are also countries that recognize Maduro right now, and that's Russia, that's China, that's Iran. It's less important than places like Nicaragua with Ortega and Cuba, recognize him anyway.
And Bolivia. And Honduras, I think.
But
the only foreign Latin.
But the point I'm making there is when you're talking about the big countries in the world, they're asking for accountability, whereas Russia and China and Iran, which that's now a serious axis. This is no longer pariah land where you're by yourself, have said, no, it's President Maduro. The legitimacy is there. And my point sort of is, if you're thinking about the balance of all those forces and you have those countries saying it's Maduro, and then you have everybody else saying, let's see the voter tabs, like the China-Russia thing is going to win out, I think, in that balance unless something meaningfully changes in the international community. And this is where I would send it back to you and ask how you feel about this as somebody who's from the region. And I've been saying this for 12 to 18 months now. Where is Brazil? Because Brazil is the hegemon in this part of the world. Brazil, I know it's a joke, and I know that Brazil is always the country of the future.
No, it's not a joke. I'm laughing because I was thinking exactly the same.
Okay, good.
So the question is about Brazil.
Yeah.
So first, I think we have to see Brazil in contrast with the US in this process. So, because Brazil doesn't want to do what the US will do. This is the opportunity of Brazil to differentiate itself as a key power in the Americas, okay? So this is a huge opportunity because I think this is the only case, and this is the most important case this year, where you have the whole region really concerned in the same way. Maybe the US is concerned about its election at the same time, so it is more important, but in terms of foreign politics, in this moment, Venezuela is at the center of the conversation. So you have this contrast between Brazil and the US. The US already spoke. They are claiming accountability, but at the same time, it is like you feel that it's playing in the same way it was playing always with Venezuela. At the same time, I do think that Brazil is not doing nothing. Brazil had a statement, a joint statement. Then you have that at the same time, Lula is not speaking out, but his foreign minister has spoken out. And you have that in Colombia at the same time, they have done it. And I do think that there are internal, not public conversation right now. And I do think that is the way that Brazil is working. And then, smartly, they will celebrate if they can do some change with these internal conversations. But nothing happens if it will not succeed. So I mean that Brazil is saying, hey, we will do what we can do, but we're not going to commit with something that maybe we will not win. Because Brazil will not endorse Maduro anymore within this process, okay? Lula very early said that he's claiming for transparency and free elections, along with other leftists like Petro and Boric. Just a footnote, Petro will be in silence because their negotiations that are guaranteed by Venezuela are part of this. So Petro will not say anything. Then you have Boric, who already spoke. And it's okay, he gave another taste of the left in Latin America. And then you have Brazil with this important role, who, if they will not endorse Maduro first, if not, the other option is, will you endorse the opposition? But if you endorse the opposition and Maduro keeps in power, you are losing power. So you cannot, in this moment as Brazil, can be the key actor that eventually will lose its opportunity to really solve the problem. So it's very tricky for Brazil, I would say. And they don't want to be the US. They don't want to have this US approach. They want to be the mediators.
Yes, that's exactly right. And they are emulating the U.S. in the way that they don't want to be the U.S. The U.S. also did not want to be the imperial hegemon. It talked all the time about how it wasn't the imperial hegemon, and now it is the imperial hegemon. So right down to that, Brazil is doing it. If I agree that what you're saying is what's real, and it is pragmatic, and it's particularly risk averse. But if I was a geopolitical strategist advising Lula or Bolsonaro or whoever was in charge of Brazil right now, you got to have at least one strategist in the room who's going to tell you something like this. Hey, this is an opportunity to create the Lula doctrine. You want to fight against the United States and the Monroe doctrine and the United States saying that everything happens in this part of the world happens with the grace of the United States involved and all these other countries, China, Russia, stop recognizing Maduro. This is the United States' backyard. If Lula really wants to puncture that, boom, say, no, this is South America. We no longer accept the opinions of the Americans or the Chinese or the Russians. Brazil will be the one that mediates this with other countries and with other stakeholders in the region. And that means, Mr. Maduro, I want to see the tabs. And if we don't have the voter tabs, here are the concrete things that will happen next, or the things that Brazil can do to utilize its power, whether it's economic or soft or political or military, to sort of go down that route. I don't think anyone, maybe somebody's advising Lula that and he's ignoring it. But I will say, like, that's the geopolitical strategist in me wants to say, yes, it's risky. Yes, you might lose. But doing what you're doing, like you said, you're just turning Venezuela into Ortega.
You have something else in Latin America, which I do think Lula and his team are still anchored to this, which is the old school left. What that you do not have as a big group in the US, and it's very Latin American in this way, this nostalgia about the left that prevent these people, sometimes youngsters, to see how Cuba and Venezuela are real authoritarian regimes. And in addition to that, that leaving them to the opposition means that you are giving the power to the right. And Lula, I think, has this in mind at the same time. So your support widely in Latin America is mostly from the left, and the left is fragmented between those who support Maduro still and those who do not. So your base as an hegemony is the left, it's not the right. So that's completely different. And so when you are looking for, like, to make your base content enough, it's like to really make them happy, it's about managing these different lines and perspectives about Venezuela. So that is why I understand that. So his new kind of hegemony is at the same time an hegemony from the left, but at the same time facing an old school left from Latin America that cannot detach from these dictatorships still.
Yeah.
I hear you on the nostalgia, and in some ways, to me, it underscores the point. And it's actually strange that the American analyst is the one who's going to make this point. But let's go down the list of countries that we just talked about: Honduras, Nicaragua, Cuba, even Venezuela. Part of the reason that these political situations exist in these countries is because the United States had its foot on the scale. it was pushing things in one direction or another. So you have these authoritarian states in these places because the United States, in the context of the Cold War, and with Venezuela, it goes back even further. Venezuela goes back to the UK casting its eyes on Venezuela and wanting access to its oil, and the United States coming in and saying, hey, United Kingdom, you don't get to do that. We're the boss here. We've kicked the Spanish out. Like, it goes that far back. But in some ways, the countries where you have these dictatorships are the ones where the United States eviscerated the opposition or tried to. Chile is an interesting test case because the United States also was active in Chile and going after the left, of course, with Allende. And Boric is really the first leftist response to everything that happens after Allende. So there might be like an interesting thing to sort of go up there. I also don't take Boric that seriously because he's got the Andes between the problem and him. So he could say whatever he wants. Whereas Colombia, Brazil, there are no Andes mountains separating them from that. But I take your point.
But you have one more layer, which is the core idea of fraud. So, because we have to be careful about this. So we have a recent history of the right wing in different countries in Latin America claiming fraud, which actually equalizes and equalize you with us with the US, right? So in the Americas, you have this right wing movement, parties, leaders claiming fraud. And now you have that in Venezuela, this is really happening, right? In the other countries, you did not have like enough evidence for that, so it looked like fake news. Okay, I buy it, it's right. But then you have this. So to what extent accepting this fraud with all the exceptionalism that we can understand from Venezuela means a win from the right in the region, right? And the next question is how easily you want to give. I would not agree with this, but to what extent you as Brazil, as Lula in particular, you want to give this easy win to the right. And I do think that this is part of the chess. Because why? Because if you think of the long run, Lula, if he runs to re-election, he will have the right wing claiming fraud. Again, and you are giving, like, let's say, symbolic, at least, tools to the right to make their claim. So this idea of fraud in this election will transcend beyond Venezuela, I think. Because at the end, you are saying to the right, hey, these leftists, they do this. And maybe they will not be the last one.
Mm-hmm. Somewhere Bolivar is turning over in his grave at all of this left-right stuff when it really should be a time to rise up. I can't help but put my own sort of analytical experience in here. I don't know, did you see the video of Maduro speaking to the people today where he was talking about the results and what was going to happen next? I had this...
No, I saw... I didn't see the video.
You didn't see it. So I watched it, and I don't speak Spanish, so I had to read it with the subtitles and like watching other people translate it and things like that. But I had this deja vu of when I was a young Middle East analyst at Stratfor. In my first 12 months there was when the Arab Spring kicked off. And we were, I think it was late on a Thursday or a Friday afternoon, we were all in the office and we were watching what was happening in Egypt and in Tahrir Square. And everybody said, you know, Mubarak is going to step down. The people are putting pressure on him. The military is putting pressure on him. The United States is putting pressure on him. And then he announced a speech to the people. And so everybody got around the TV. And I mean, I was wrong about many things with the Arab Spring. First among them being that I didn't think it was going to happen. But we all got around the TV and everybody was expecting him to step down. And I said, guys, he's not going to step down. I guarantee you right now, this is not a speech to tell you that he's stepping down. And he didn't. He went out there and he said, I am the father of the people. I am the leader of the blah, 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 blah. 3 days later, he was gone. Like, the military got rid of him stage right. Now, the military is still in charge. There was no change in the actual regime. They flirted with the Muslim Brotherhood and they flirted with some democracy, and now there's a general in charge and the military still controls everything. I cannot help but think that maybe that's what we're headed towards, whether it's the military or whether it's the criminal forces behind Maduro, whoever is really calling the shots here. Just give Maduro as much rope as he can take, and then once it becomes obvious that he's painfully out of touch, take him out, but nothing actually changes on a regime level, and maybe even the people who are actually controlling the power structures increase their control, but they get some tip of the nod from the Lulas of the world who say, oh, like they got rid of Maduro, so they did the things that were necessary. It's hard to take something that happened in history in a completely different part of the world and apply it here, but I cannot but help feel like a weird, tingly, spidey feeling that that is the path that we're going down here right now.
I do agree. I had also this intuition that somehow this resonates with what happened in Egypt, but I didn't have the knowledge to really extrapolate it. But I think that you are right. I do think that Maduro does not have the incentives to leave or the costs to, or if that he has enough costs to stay. I do think that still he has, as you mentioned, the support from Russia, China, and Iran, his key partners. The military, initially very obscure in their messages, now it's clear that they are supporting him. So why should I leave? That is my question. And I do not find any answer so far to really sustain that he has the incentives or the costs to leave. I would say, and it brings us to the initial conversations, that first, if he doesn't have a way to prove making up the ballots in any way, to prove that he won this election, first, and secondly, if he really feels that the majority of the people is against them and this could endure, so if he doesn't find a way to prove that he won, even if he make it up. Secondly, if the streets endure, and thirdly, if the neighbors really make pressure, maybe you can find some military actors or criminal actors with better incentives to kick him out. So the question is first about incentives and costs for him, and then incentives and costs for those surrounding him that could take his power. And I do think, like you, that is more likely, even it is more likely than the opposition taking power in the short run.
Yeah, Brian Winter at America's Quarterly, who I think is one of the best English writing analysts out there about the region in general, he put out a piece earlier today, and he really emphasized what you just said. He takes it a step further. He talks about, and I didn't know this until I read his article and did a little more research, but Maduro himself and numerous other officials are facing indictments in U.S. courts on drug trafficking charges, on corruption, on human rights abuses, all these other different types of charges. And that's really important because that means if they're going to step down or leave, that means they're going to a supermax jail in the United States. And if that sounds abstract or fantastical, just look at the example of Orlando Hernandez in the last couple of years. This is the former president of Honduras, who is president and close with the United States on a security level right up until he leaves office. And then he is, like, within years, like I forget exactly what the timeline was, but 2 or 3 years, he's in a U.S. court and he's being thrown in jail for the rest of his life because he had drug trafficking and weapons smuggling and all these other things. And that's before you even get into the Gaddafi example or the Assad example, all these other examples of regimes where when the dictator gives an inch, things completely go crazy. So I think you're right. There is no incentive structure. And maybe the military was waiting for that. Maybe there were officials who were looking for the United States or Brazil or some combination of all of them to give them blanket amnesty or some kind of assurances that they wouldn't be thrown into a jail afterwards if they were going to make the move, and maybe they didn't get the assurances. I don't know. That's highly speculative. But it just goes to show you, like, it's life and death, not just for Maduro, but for all of these officials that are at the top. And for as long as that is the case, that's.
That being said, we completely agree. And I think I sent you a message on Sunday about this. It was like, so at the same time, let's say Maduro wants to leave. He's planning to leave. He needs a plan and to execute and eventually this plan, right? Execute this plan. So this plan should include leaving the country and leaving the country with money to a country that is willing to host him, right? So which could be Russia, could be Cuba, could be Iran. I don't think it's China, okay? So that requires time. So even if he's planning to leave the country without any of his partners, he needs to make all these arrangements, right? And he needs time. He needs time to really ensure that this long trip, because in any case this will be a long trip, unless he goes to Nicaragua. It just came to my mind, right? But changing the power in Venezuela to go into Nicaragua to be like, no, this is not someone with this kind of power that's really to do. So I see himself like in Russia. I see himself maybe in Iran, more difficult. In an Arab country, maybe, could be. It's more difficult, right?
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I feel like we're flirting with a line of analytical thought, which I'm having trouble refuting, but which is unsatisfying, which is that not like this is not going to change anything. Like there's the excitement of the moment, but probably fundamentally we're still in the same world. Tell me why.
I do not think that this will be the same world. I do not think.
Great. Tell me why.
What I do think is that if he stays in power, he will be more a dictator than before. Okay, so I do think that this election is a before and after for Venezuela, for better or worse. And I think this word worst is more likely as after this conversation, right? So because now you don't have any kind of legitimacy out of power, out of violence, out of force. Before, Maduro could say, hey, I won the election. I won the election because the candidates were imprisoned. I won the election because there were no other candidates, but I won the election. Now, I do not think that he can do this because he cannot prove that he won this election. And the only thing that is maintaining him here is power and corruption. In addition to that, I have to say that would this change the partnerships and the structure of power in Venezuela? Maybe. So you have that those who are endorsing Maduro are Iran, China, and Russia. We do know that maybe one of the, I'm going to exaggerate this, one of the headquarters of Hezbollah in Latin America is Venezuela. That's something that has been studied. At the same time, you have that one of the tentacles of Russia in the world is Venezuela, and a key partner of China in the same way it's Brazil and Mexico and Peru is Venezuela. Venezuela is a key partner of China. So the next question is criminal organizations. And I think that is very important. Because what you can say now is that the Venezuela government is a criminal organization, but it is not the only one. It is a criminal organization that has a state power in linkages with other criminal organizations within the country, and actually you can argue outside the country. So because you can discuss to what extent Tren de Aragua is linked to the government or supported by, or to what extent those mining operations, illegal operations in the border with Brazil are also supervised or managed, or at least supported by the government. So would this change? So this is a next question. What I would argue is that this process would strengthen all of them if Maduro endures.
Yeah.
That would be my argument.
No, I agree with that. There was a great piece written by, getting his name because I want to give him credit, Jeremy McDermott, in InsideCrime.org. And I'm not sure that I agree with everything in his piece, but he talks about predictions for after the election. And he's basically accepting that Maduro is probably going to stay in power. And he talks about it's going to lead to a new wave of migration, especially in the United States, but specifically about a massive increase in transnational crime in general. And that's also an increase on oil smuggling and gold smuggling, and all these oil brokers and things like that. More involvement in cocaine trade and drugs and things like that. He also specifically calls out undermining Colombia's peace strategy to try and destabilize things there. I'm not sure if I agree with that, but it's an interesting thought exercise to do. But I also take your point. I think the major change here, and the reason that we shouldn't just say, like he's going to stay in power, now he's just a dictator in name, is that Venezuela is a huge country, and it's a country that is strategically located, and it has all sorts of resources. And if it's open business now, and it's just might makes right, and it's just who has the guns, whereas the trappings of everything else are gone. Wow, I mean, it's not just that you have this outpost of Russia and China in the Western Hemisphere. It's you now have a center for all of these transnational criminal groups where, they have access to resources, access to territory. Like, in some ways, it's their dream, and they're no longer confined to a Nicaragua or to a Cuba or something like that.
And maybe that is the discussion that Brazil, that the US, that Peru, that Colombia, that Argentina are not having together. Because I talked a lot about the left and the right in Latin America, and this old school left and right and the new left and right. Okay, and it fragments us. But what can really bring us together is if we see that all our domestic policies on crime will not work if we have this hub of crime in the country with so much money, so much power, so much support, at the same time with all those people fleeing the country, which arguably would increase in the next month if Maduro stays in power. So you will, the correct word is accelerated, because it's already huge. So it would accelerate this current migration process. So you have migration and crime could be the most important outcomes of this electoral process in terms of the region. Okay, in addition to like this discussion that doesn't matter about where if the embassy is closed or not. So what really matters for all of these countries is, okay, would this increase crime? Would we be able to solve our domestic crime if we are not able to face this regional crime hub in the middle of the Americas? And I think that unifies all of the region. From the US, from Canada, you can say, to the Patagonia.
You're right, although again, these analogies are imperfect, so I'm only using them to try and stir up conversation. I don't think it's a one-to-one comparison. We already talked about Egypt in the context of the Arab Spring, but that scenario you just talked about is the Syria model. which is a breakdown, and now one of the most important countries that is a linchpin of all these different forces is up for grabs, and different forces are there, and criminal elements are there, and a minority authoritarian regime is there too. And the direct consequence of Syria falling apart was ISIS and the rise of ISIS in the Middle East. And only once ISIS was taking over Iraq and beating on the door of Iran and beating on the door of the Saudis did everybody look at each other. Moscow and Washington and Tehran and Riyadh, they all looked at each other and said, okay, like, let's get rid of these crazy jihadis, and then we can go back to fighting our battles and pushing our pawns all across the Middle East chessboard. I say that to say it took the rise of the Islamic State to bring all those people together. I don't think that a contested election in Venezuela, even if all those different actors agree on some level like you're talking about, they're going to need something a lot more serious to actually stop talking about, well, we're going to put out a joint statement and say, no, like, this genie has to go back in the bottle, otherwise we're setting ourselves up for, it's not going to be ISIS. Like, I'm not talking about jihadis running rampant in the Amazon, but whatever the Latin American sort of, whoever fills in the power vacuum in that part of the world, like, that's what it's going to look like.
But maybe that is so I agree with you that we need something stronger. What I wanted to say is that maybe that is what the geopolitical strategists should say to Lula. Because I think that that narrative against international crime, against migration, to be clear, not against migration because of Venezuelans moving, because they are the first to suffer, because against migration because it's a geopolitical problem itself, to having people moving from one place to another, suffering and relocated with no services for them. So it is a huge problem for all of us. And I think that narrative would stick. I think that that is a very good narrative for bringing all these countries together. But I agree at the same time with you that we need a stronger claim for that. I would have a question for you, Jaco. I know that you are the interviewer here, but I think that you are better than me to answer this. So what do you think would be the impact of this process in the elections in the U.S., if there is any?
Well, first of all, these are always meant to be conversations. I trick people into the idea that it's an interview. I really just want to shoot the shit and put it out. So don't feel any compunction about that. The cynical, off-the-cuff answer is nobody cares about Venezuela and the United States. I mean, the Trump administration literally tried its own demented, half-cocked version of the Bay of Pigs with Juan Guaido. Did anybody talk about that, like, in the context of the election? No. There are two ways that it indirectly affects things. The first is the price of oil, and if you look at oil prices and what's happening in Venezuela, there's some interesting things happening there with oil weakness, what we've seen. But the second, to your point, is migration. I think the last time we were on the podcast, we talked about this. Venezuelans are one of the largest, if not the largest, groups that are encountering U.S. border agents at the U.S.-Mexico border. It's not Mexicans. It's not even folks from the Golden Triangle. The Venezuelans are surging upwards. And the reason that matters is because now presidential candidate Kamala Harris is the border czar. So if we're really about to get another huge influx of momentum northwards because of what's happening in Venezuela, that doesn't look particularly good for her or for her record, and that plays into the hands of Trump and the Republicans. But Venezuela itself, I don't think is going to make waves in the U.S. election. It has to somehow be tied to something like oil, which can affect inflation, or it has to be tied to migration, which is at the top of minds of the U.S. voter.
I have two comments about it. So I do think that in general, on average, there is no impact. But I would say that there are at least two ways that it could have, I would not say indirect, I would say direct impact. Small, but maybe important. First is the impact on the Latinos voting in the U.S. Okay? So, and arguably in some in some of the states, of the swing states, like Wisconsin, where I am right now, Pennsylvania, or others, what you would have is that this small number of Latino voters will have a very important part in the final outcome. So what the U.S. current government, so what would Biden and Harris say and do about this may resonate on them. And this connects to the second point, which is it could be a really good excuse for Republicans to frame the discussion about Venezuela, socialism, communism, and eventually how this country would become a socialist country, Venezuela-like. That we, you and me, are pretty sure that will not happen, but voters are a different discussion.
Yeah, I just had this sinking thought where, Trump, it doesn't seem to me, has landed on a particularly good nickname for Kamala Harris yet. He always, gets the nickname for the person that he's running against. And I hope that no Republican strategist is listening to this, but Kamala Chavez does have a little ring to it, doesn't it?
Kamala Chavez.
Oh, God.
Or Maduro Harris.
Yeah.
So
Harris,
yes, but you got my point.
Or Harris Maduro. Oh, God. I hate myself. Yeah. Okay.
So you got my point. So this could be framed because there is, I was reading some comments on YouTube and on Twitter, and it's like, yes, so Kamala will make America Venezuela. And now you have Venezuela in the center of the conversation. So I think that these two ideas of what is the impact on the Latino community, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, those who has an important amount of vote, and what is the framing that Republicans can turn this discussion right now into.
Yeah.
So that would be my...
Well, let me turn this back around on you before we get out of here with one sort of major question, which is, let me ask you the same question in sort of a different way about the region itself. Because a lot of the countries that we've talked about, Cuba, Nicaragua, even Honduras, Venezuela, it's maybe a little unfair to put Honduras in that same group, but I'll throw them in anyway. These are all countries that have had the same problem for a long time. It's not a surprise that we are here. And, Chavismo has been, this is since the late 80s, early 90s, since this has been developing. So it's not something new. Can this metastasize? So if Maduro does stay in power and it does become, one thing that it's a hub for criminals and migration and all these other things that we talked about. But does it start to then, does it destabilize Colombia? Does Ecuador fall next? Does Peru fall next? Like, do these countries start adding to it? Because, ultimately the map in terms of a, great power, different foots on the scale, that's not changing that much. But the difference would come if another big country in the region, which is not currently down this path, shifts over or goes in that direction. Does that question make sense? Do you have any concerns about what happens in Venezuela going outwards in that way, not just from a criminal migration point of view, but from a real destabilizing political institutions and structures in these surrounding countries point of view?
So it brings us back to the last conversation with you about crime. So I do think that the major political risk in the medium run for Latin America is states have been taken by the criminal organization in different ways, directly or indirectly, to become crime havens, right? So I think that this conversation, when we developed our analysis while having the conversation, we ended up saying that maybe Venezuela is right now what other countries could become, but not in terms of the leftist dictatorship that the political discussion is having, but in terms of how a country can become gradually a crime haven, a crime hub. And I think that is the benchmark that we should do instead of countries could become left authoritarian regimes. So that being said, I would argue that democracies are more likely to confront this transnational crime that is trying to take the nation as a whole than authoritarian regimes who are easier becoming partners of criminal organizations. It doesn't mean that democracies can confront them at all in all terms, as you can see in Mexico, where you have some territories that are completely dominated by criminal organizations. So if you ask me what is this metastasis like going to, I would say it is not a discussion about left and right. It is a discussion about democracies versus authoritarian regimes that eventually are linked to criminal organizations if you want to see it as a matrix where you can have like the more authoritarian you become, the more a crime hub you will be. And you can see it in Venezuela, you can see it in Nicaragua. Maybe Cuba is a different conversation because it's the longest one-party rule story in the region. So you have a very strong ideology and control of the state and the island. But as you said in your previous podcast, so when the regime falls down in Cuba, it is more likely that criminal organizations would take the state than opposition, if there is any, or any other kind of power. So metastasis is about mafias and crime. It's not about leftist authoritarian regimes only.
Not a particularly uplifting note to end on. Anything else we missed before we get out of here, Hila?
I really hope that the Venezuelan people organize themselves, the opposition organizes themselves as a one single collective, as they could do it during the election. I would expect, ideally, to the opposition as a political group to become partners of the streets, that I think is the key challenge right now. And even if there is violence that I think already started and will continue, I hope they can endure enough to weaken Maduro, whatever the future outcome will be. Because I do think that Chavismo and Maduro must end their term as soon as possible. That is my idealistic approach, and I wanted to end with this.
Well, I won't dirty your idealism. Let's just say that I hope that is what happens too, and we'll go from there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.